Yeah, I believe that Christ's suffering and the demonstration of the kind of physiologic stress that his human body was under is manifested in the Garden of Gethsemane, where it's described that he was sweating blood. And there is a well-documented medical condition in which patients who are under tremendous amount of emotional stress and physiological stress can, in fact, sweat blood, because little blood vessels within the glands burst, and then the blood is expressed. The scourge involved the use of a short whip with pieces of typically metal, sometimes bone, sometimes pieces of porcelain wrapped in these leather straps, which is then utilized to come across typically the back, the shoulders, the legs of the victim. The first few passes across a particular body part would tear through the skin, the fat, but eventually, once the outer layers were torn away, it would start getting in the muscle and the tendon. And of course, along the way, you're ripping through all the blood vessels that supply all those tissues. And so you're losing blood the whole time. The plant that was described actually had a very long thorn, not the little thorns that we would think from a rose bush. These were thorns that were typically 1.5 to 2 inches in length. The scalp is one of the most vascular portions of our bodies. It had a huge blood supply up there. So then having those thorns shoved down into down onto the bony plate would have gone through all the scalp, which in and of itself would have created a huge amount of blood loss. I've seen people actually bleed to death from just a scalp injury. So it's not a small injury to have, who knows, dozens of these things shoved into your scalp. And so that would have caused more blood loss. Typically, when a victim has to carry the cross, what has been described in the literature, in actual Roman literature, is they describe they carry the crossbar, and the crossbar is estimated alone was estimated to weigh about 110 pounds. And of course, if your arms are stuck out here, wrapped up on the crossbar, and you fall down, you need help getting up. You just can't get up on your own, because there's no possible way without your arms to get up. So he would have needed help getting up. If he fell over, there's a good chance that he could have hit his chest, which then could account for the possibility of a cardiac injury. Anatomically, we consider the wrists as part of the hand, and so with the placement of the nails between the radius and the ulna, at that position, it still fits the definition of being in the hand, and it's in a position in which the nail won't rip out, which you have to have a solid point of fixation. Another interesting point about the placement of that is the median nerve goes right straight through that particular portion of the wrist, and so there would have been either destruction of the nerve or impingement of the nerve that would have created a tremendous amount of pain, so that every time you try to take a breath, it'd be agonizing. You'd be pushing down on spiked feet, which of course hurt, and then you'd be hanging on spiked arms. And so you alternate from excruciating pain to excruciating pain every time you take a breath. So even if he survives the actual crucifixion, he would have had to survive what I believe to be a lethal injury from the spear, just to find out whether he was alive or not. What's described is the loss of water and blood, and that would entail either either pleural effusion or pericardial effusion, and the blood would have come from either pulmonary artery, pulmonary vein, the aorta or vena cava, or the heart itself. None of those injuries, unless you're treated immediately by a trauma surgeon like myself, with all the advanced equipment that we have, would be survivable after even a few minutes. Christ, as the Son of God, could have survived anything. He chose to manifest himself as a human at that point in time, and allowed himself to die. And being human at that point in time, he could not have survived this particular series of traumas. It's not possible. Christ as God could have survived anything they threw at him. But he chose to be Christ, the human, at that point in time to die for our sins. And that given that self-limitation of remaining to be human, he died. He did not survive the event. I'm profoundly impacted by it. Because I realized the price that he paid was something I would never be willing to do for probably anybody. It's very difficult for me to even sing songs about the cross, even in worship. Because I truly do understand what he paid, the price that he paid.
It's the most important event in history.
What did it feel like?
One weekend that split time into before and after.
What did it look like?
If you believe, it defines your whole existence.
What really happened?
But how much do you really know about the cross?
Any illustrations I saw of the crucifixion were of a fairly placid Jesus looking down in pity from the cross. This was not a pretty picture.
Dr. Carl McCurdy has studied Jesus' crucifixion and has filled in many scientific details that the Bible leaves out.
Jesus allowed himself to suffer, and I couldn't imagine a worse way to die.
Jesus said, "This is your hour, when darkness reigns." Luke 22:52 and 53.
Thursday night, April 6th, 30 AD. Most historians agree this is the date of Jesus' arrest.
Pilate had Jesus flogged and handed him over to be crucified. Mark 15:15.
For prisoners sentenced to crucifixion, the first step was flogging. The Romans used a whip called a flagrum. It was specially designed to rip the skin off a prisoner's back.
They had it down to an art. The iron would make bruises, but then these pieces of bone would begin to cut into the skin and the subcutaneous tissue, and actually would result in lacerations all the way down to the muscle. The pain would be intense and unrelenting. The point of the scourging was to bring the victim as close to exhaustion and as close to death as possible before actually taking him to the cross.
The soldiers twisted together a crown of thorns and set it on his head. Then they struck him on the head again and again. Matthew 27:29 and 30.
Next, for Jesus, a special punishment. The thorns themselves were most likely several inches long and horribly painful.
The face and the scalp have probably the best blood supply of any areas of skin on the body. You also have some of the most nerves, some of the greatest number of nerves in the skin would be on the scalp and the face. Again, intense, sharp pain.
They seized Simon of Cyrene, put the cross on him, and made him carry it. Luke 23:26.
It weighed between 80 and 110 pounds, and knowing that Jesus could not carry what the Romans called the patibulum gives clues about the beating he'd already suffered.
One thing that we see in trauma is that a young person, a person who is in good condition, may be much closer to death than we think from the blood loss. So even though Jesus at this point was stumbling and could remain upright, he was probably very near the edge of total circulatory collapse.
He went out to the place of the skull, and here they crucified him. John 19:17.
Crucifixion was a relatively bloodless process. The nails Romans used resembled railroad spikes. There was one pounded through both feet, and one hammered through each wrist.
A nail or spike through the palm would never hold the weight of a body, but the spike inserted through here would get right in the middle of those wrist bones and would enable the body to be suspended by the strength of those ligaments. The pain would be like hot liquid. It would be a hot shooting pain back up the arm. It would leave the hand in a claw shape and paralyzed.
Death on a cross had little to do with nails. Instead, crucifixion normally meant death by suffocation.
The only way you can adequately breathe would be to push up with the impaled feet, pull up with the arms in order to breathe, and then sag down again in exhaustion. And obviously, every time that happened, there was intense pain in the arms. The scourged back would rub against the rough wood of the cross. The impaled feet would also have their own nerve pain and pain shooting up the legs. And it would be pure agony to simply take a breath.
With a loud cry, Jesus breathed his last. Mark 15:37.
Crucifixion often took days, but Jesus died quickly, and as the loud cry suggests, he also died suddenly.
A catastrophic terminal event is a pathologist's phrase to mean that something happened all of it to cause death. And my feeling would be that his scourging was so intense, the blood loss that preceded the crucifixion was so intense that shortened the length of time of the crucifixion. And in this case, the final event was I'm sure either an abnormal heart rhythm or his heart simply stopped.
At the place where Jesus was crucified, there was a new tomb, and they laid Jesus there. John 19:41 and 42.
On April 7th, 30 AD, the world turned dark. Jesus is dead. Friday is over. But Sunday is coming.